This is American government in some ways for both Wednesday and Friday, November 3rd and November 5th. I wasn't feeling well yesterday, so prior to lecturing on the presidency and historical development, on Wednesday we had spent part of the time finishing up the party system, and then I had begun discussing the origins and original intention for the presidency. I got through about 1/3 of that, so I thought what I would do is finish that lecture, these notes, and send it out to you. And this will partially make up for the class that we missed yesterday. So this lecture describes and discusses the material on the presidency in the Nichols Reader, from which begins the selection begins on page. It's number 40 on page 223. What this selection from the Nichols Reader is a distillation of Hamilton's essays on the presidency from Federalist 70, the great theoretical essay about the nature of executive power and its primary tasks, and then the next several Federalist papers, 71, 72, 73, and 74. And what I try to do in this lecture is to lay out Hamilton's understanding of the executive and his understanding of what the executive requires and how the Constitution is designed so as to secure both a strong, energetic is the term he uses, and yet constitutional executive, which is both powerful and limited at the same time, operating within the Constitution and the Constitution's grant of powers, but then also truly grounded in popular sentiment. And so these comments essentially can be grouped into three things which you should keep distinct. The first is Hamilton's understanding of what energy in the executive is. As I mentioned in class, Hamilton uses this term, and he says it's critical to a well-designed executive institution, but he doesn't quite define what executive is, and that's what I do for you on the first page of the notes which accompany the posting of this recording. And as you'll see, he says the critical quality which a well-designed executive needs is energy. And then he explains why you need energy in the executive. It's because of the unique tasks of the executive. Now, I went over these in class on Wednesday, and I'm just going to repeat them briefly in my comments here. But you have to distinguish them from the next set of four. So, as you're going to see, these comments will explain what he means by energy and the way he sets up the issue in Federalist 70. Then it will talk about the main reasons you need energy in the executive for the four tasks. Then, starting in Federalist 70 and through the next couple of pages in the Nichols Reader, he explains the four institutional ingredients of executive energy. That is to say, the four institutional qualities that a well-designed executive must possess. And at the risk of being repetitive, I'll say what those are. Those are unity, adequate support, duration, competent powers. Actually, unity, duration, competent powers, and adequate support and competent powers. And then I'll explain what those ingredients are. The last part of these comments are what I would say Hamilton describes as the passionate or emotional substructure of the presidency. That is to say, what kind of individuals and as you're going to see, these aspects constitute a kind of a remarkable and fascinating comment on what both Hamilton and probably the framers in general thought were the kinds of political passions that make people become politicians, on the grounds that politicians are different from you and me. Obviously, they're human beings, most of them. But as you're going to see, Hamilton suggests that politicians are moved by human passions, of course, but by certain kinds of human passions. And I'm going to suggest that there's a ranking there. And when you see what's at the top of the kinds of passions that draw people to political office, and indeed the presidency, you'll see that in some ways what Hamilton had in mind was an office that that offered the possibility of greatness. And we'll see how he suggests that in what he thinks the emotional appeal of the presidency is. So, what energy is in the executive, why the executive needs energy, the 4 tasks of the executive, then the 4 institutional ingredients of a well-designed constitutional executive, and then last, the passions that Hamilton thinks the presidency appeals to. Again, as I said in class, Hamilton starts out by posing an issue that the opponents of the Constitution have argued. Now, as I set this up in class, I reminded you that when I spoke about the Constitutional Convention, I said that the Constitution had embraced 3 political novelties, new things that had never been accomplished or achieved before in political life or attempted. One was the new kind of federalism, where instead of the prior either or had been a confederation or a national state, the Constitution, that is to say, a confederation with sovereign states in a derivative weak center, or a strong national government with subordinate local units. The Constitution tries to create, as we saw in Chapter 3 in our discussion of federalism, a new kind of federalism which divides sovereignty. And what it tries to create is a new national government which is supreme but limited within its sphere over semi-sovereign states. That's the new federalism. The second one was the either or in political life before had been either you had a huge government, a huge society, and a huge nation, or you had free republican government. Republican government meaning here popular government, as Lincoln says in the last line of the Gettysburg Address, of the people, by the people, for the people. So the Constitution for the first time creates a huge extensive republic, and that's what Madison discusses, as we saw and defends in Federalist 10. Then the third either or in political life had been either you had a popular government, a republican government grounded in the will of the people and generally vibrating to the will of the people, or you could have a strong executive, a vigorous, energetic executive. And so he begins Federalist at 70 by saying there are those who think that you can't combine these two things, a vigorous, energetic executive and a truly limited, responsible, popular form of government. And he says the people that make that argument better hope that they're wrong, because you can't have a good government without an energetic executive. And so this is the third great novelty, the energetic, constitutional, popular executive. And so to go back to Hamilton's argument, he says the people that make that argument better hope they're wrong, because if that's the case, then that means you can't have popular Republican government being good government, because you need an energetic executive for a good government. So then what's energy? This is the quality he doesn't define. So this is my definition. By energy, he means the capacity for swift, decisive, forceful action. And only the executive branch needs that in a sense and is capable of summoning it and has to summon it. Why? And in the next paragraph, which I explained in class, Hamilton gives 4 tasks of the executive. That is to say, in answer to the question, why must the executive branch possess energy, this capacity for swift, decisive, forceful action? It's because of the unique tasks that the executive has in government. And so Hamilton has 4 of them. 2 of them, as I mentioned in class, are fairly self-evident or clear. It's for the defense of the nation. To quote him and then to translate it as I translated in class, it's essential for the protection of the community against foreign attacks. Defense. We expect the executive branch to defend the nation. And of course that's reflected in the Constitution's granting of the commander-in-chief power to the president. It is not less essential to the steady administration of the laws, what I defined in class as law enforcement, and using the example of speeding and why you need policemen to enforce speeding laws, because otherwise a law simply becomes an interesting suggestion rather than a law, unless it has enforcement. And then the last 2, which are, I think, hard to understand and I think need to be thought about and translated. To the protection of property against those irregular and high-handed combinations which sometimes interrupt the ordinary course of judgment, And I translate that task as the providing of order as the foundation of society. We think of law and order, and we think that law leads to order, and God willing it does. But I think what Hamilton means here is that human beings are so fractious, as Madison points out in Federalist 10, so given to faction, that to some degree law requires a kind of stable provision of force in order to allow order to take place so that you can have the rule of law. And then last, to the security of liberty against the enterprise and assaults of ambition, faction, and anarchy. And here I think Hamilton is the quality or the task that he means here is leadership, in the sense that, and this goes back to Federalist 10, that in a free government where people are free to speak their minds and assert their interests and associate, there is a naturally centrifugal tendency, a tendency to divide society's attention and to be noisy, complicated, and anarchical. And so I think Hamilton actually thinks in a well-constructed popular government, you need an executive to provide the focus of leadership. And we will come back to this on Wednesday when we talk about Kennedy's campaign speech, number 42, I believe it is, in the Nichols Reader, on the 4 kinds of leadership that the presidency. So I think those are the 4 tasks of the executive: defense, law enforcement, the providing of order upon which society rests, and when you see in an emergency or natural disaster, when you see that order taken away, you see the chaos that sometimes ensues, and of course leadership. So those are the 4 tasks. Now, again, remember you have to distinguish between Hamilton setting up the necessity for energy in the executive here, and then the next major topic, which he then applies in Federalist 70 and the subsequent papers as part of the Nichols Reader selection number 40 here. And those 4 so the next topic is what aspects, institutional, I call them components or ingredients, must the executive branch have. And here you have to pay attention because you can be misled by the language that he uses. So the 4 institutional ingredients or components which have to guide or be included in the executive institution are unity, duration, adequate support, and competent powers. So let's just quickly go through those 4 institutional ingredients. In order to have an energetic, active president, firmly rooted in Republican responsibility and constitutional powers and limits. Unity. It doesn't mean that we have to get behind the president and that kind of stuff. Unity simply means the executive must consist, or the head of the executive branch must consist of a single person. The other 2 plans in the convention, besides the final Constitution and the Hamilton plan, interestingly enough, the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan actually called for a committee executive, a plural executive, on the grounds that, and of course, you know what people were afraid of. They were afraid that a single executive would lead to monarchy. And indeed, aside from the absence of a Bill of Rights, this was one of the most common charges made against the Constitution, that the executive branch, the president, was too strong because it consisted of a single person. And yet Hamilton says unity is necessary for swift and decisive action. That's why Congress is not the commander-in-chief. Congress may declare war, according to the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8. But Congress couldn't command the troops. We kind of understand that you need focus and leadership and responsibility. So unity means a single person. And he says there are 2 ways to destroy unity. Make it a committee. And there was even a proposal in the convention to make the presidency a 3-person committee, one from the North, the Middle States, and the South. But again, that was abandoned because they came to realize the requirements of energy, and that meant a single person as the executive. The other way of destroying the unity would be to have a president over a council, and that it would be like many mayoral systems are, where the mayor or the president or the governor presides over a council, but can't act without the vote of the council. Hamilton says no, the executive has to be a single person. Unity in the executive. Duration. And duration means 2 things: a length of term, so that the person can become firm in the office, understand what he's doing, gain some knowledge on the job. but also stability long enough to resist. And there's the great quote on page 225, where he says, there would be those who would be inclined to regard the servile pliancy of the executive to a prevailing current, either in the community or in the legislature, as its best recommendations. In other words, he notes that it's true, and this is a complex point, that in a Republican executive where the president is elected by the people indirectly or directly through the Electoral College, as we saw, and therefore is responsible to people, nevertheless, the executive sometimes has to stand against some popular whim or some popular breeze of passion that may take over the people and even the Congress or the legislature. So the executive needs duration, length and term in office, in order to have the firmness to actually resist the bad ideas of the people at times. The other kind of duration that he talks about is indefinite re-eligibility. And of course, in the original Constitution, this meant that the president could be reelected, and that was true up until the 22nd Amendment, passed in the 1950s in the wake of FDR's four-term election. But nevertheless, the necessity. So it's true. You can be president a maximum of 10 years today, 2 full terms plus 2 other parts of a pre-existing term. So the 2-term presidency, nevertheless, re-eligibility is still there. Why? And here Hamilton, and we're going to come back to this because this has to do with the issue of the passions that I talked about. Hamilton talks about incentive. You have to make the executive re-eligible for election so that he has something to work for and be rewarded through re-election. And it's in the context of the incentives for re-election that Hamilton has this fascinating discussion of the passions of the presidency, that attract individuals to the presidency, which we'll come back to and finish with. Adequate support. You know, if you've done the reading, if you understand this, by adequate support, he doesn't mean that people have to get behind him or that the public opinion poll, blah, 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 blah. Adequate support simply means the president has to have an independent source of salary which cannot be raised or lowered or manipulated by the legislature. Now, the legislature Congress sets the president's salary, but the Constitution requires that it can neither be, stipulates that it can neither be raised nor lowered during a president's term, so that Congress can't threaten or bribe the president to act consistent with his executive oath or her executive oath. And that was, in fact, that many of the state legislatures did that during the time of the Articles, so that wasn't an abstract thing. And that means that Congress sets the president's salary, but before any president takes on office. For your information, the president now makes $400,000 a year. And incompetent powers. The last part of the fourth of the institutional components or ingredients: unity, duration, adequate support, and competent powers. Is the Constitution has to grant the executive sufficient specific powers to accomplish the task. And so if you look in Article 2, Section 2, you'll see that the president is the commander-in-chief. He's the head of the executive branch. He can grant pardons. He makes treaties with the Senate, with 2/3 of the Senate. He can appoint officers of the judiciary and the executive branch with the advice and consent of the Senate. He commissions all officers, and he shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And, as we saw when we looked at the Constitution, the somewhat general language of the vesting clause, the executive power shall be vested in a president, led to the kind of broad and eventual Hamiltonian expansion of the presidency. And in the notes on the second page for Wednesday, I point out that the founders were divided on the question of where the thrust of power and activity would rest in our system of government. Madison wanted Congress, especially the Senate, to lead the government, and with the president more of reactive and passive and sort of carrying into will, executing the will of the Congress. Hamilton thought that only an institution like the presidency, which would attract great individuals, driven by, as you'll see, the different passions we'll talk about, could be a center. And in some ways, as we're going to see when we look at the historical development of the presidency on Monday and the issues that kind of are controversial in the presidency, in fact, the Hamiltonian understanding that it's the presidency which is in some ways the center of leadership and action in our form of government. That the presidency has grown as the nation has grown in ways that we'll see in class on Monday and on Wednesday. Now, how do we know that? So Hamilton thinks, given these four institutional ingredients: unity, duration, adequate support, competent powers, that so the last thing I want to point out in these comments is when you see what Hamilton thought the kinds of passions that would draw people to the president, you'll see that he thought that great individuals would be drawn to it. And as we saw when we looked at the original Electoral College, the framers tried to design a selection system in which people would prove their suitability for great office through an extensive record of public accomplishment and achievement and reputation, although, as we also saw, that the Electoral College didn't work out. It was changed by the party system for better or worse, and we'll talk about that in terms of the presidency. But on page 227 of the Nichols Reader, Hamilton talks about three passions that draw people into office, and as you'll see, it's the last one which now that he has in mind for the presidency. Now, these three passions on page 227, I'm going to change the order in which he describes them, because I actually think there's a hierarchy, and there's both a lower, middle, and higher. On the bottom of the page, in the middle of the page of 227, another ill effect of the exclusion, that is to say, if you made the president not eligible for re-election, would be the temptation to sordid views, to speculation, financial speculation, and in some instances usurpation. An avaricious man who might happen to fill the office, looking forward to a time when he must at all events yield up the emoluments, another term the Constitution uses for the money, the salary, the pay you get. Emolument is just a fancy word for pay. He enjoyed, would feel a propensity, not easily resisted by such a man, to make the best use of the opportunity he enjoyed while it lasted, and he may not scruple. So avarice is a fancy term for greed, love of money. So we all have love and money, not all of us. Probably St. Francis didn't, and Jesus and Buddha. But having said that, he's right. There are people who are drawn to politics and see politics as a way of increasing their financial basis in life. And perhaps there are even people drawn to the presidency. At the bottom of the page on 227, he says, an ambitious man, when he found himself seated on the summit of his country's honors, when he looked forward to the time in which he must descend from the exalted eminence forever, and reflected that no exertion or merit on his part could save him from the unwelcome reverse. Such a man in such a situation might be violently tempted to embrace a favorable conjuncture for attempting the prolongation of his power. In fancy language, politicians, so you have avarice at the bottom, and then you have ambition. So if avarice is love of money, what's ambition? Love of power. And let's be clear. When you look at the record of constitutional governments in the 19th and the 20th and 21st century that have descended into dictatorship, whether it's Xi Jinping's changing of the Chinese constitution so that it can be infinitely reelected, or Marcos in the Philippine constitution in the 1960s, or Putin in the Russian constitution, people that get hold of power do not want to let go of it. Now, of course, in a constitutional government, you have terms of office, and you want them to let go of it. All Hamilton means is there will be people attracted to the presidency for love of power, and therefore better to gratify that love of power by giving them the opportunity and scope for great action and to be reelected as a reward so that they can hold on to that power. But there's a passion higher than love of money or love of power, than avarice or ambition. And further up on the page, one ill effect of the exclusion, that is to say, denial of re-eligibility, would be a diminution of the inducements to good behavior. There are few men who would not feel less zeal in the discharge of a duty when they were conscious that the advantages of the station with which it were connected must be relinquished at a determined period, than when they were permitted to entertain a hope of obtaining by meriting a continuance of them. This position will not be disputed as long as it is admitted that the desire of reward is one of the strongest incentives of human conduct. This is one of the first uses in the English language of the idea of incentive as a motivation for good behavior through the hope for reward. And that the best security for the fidelity of mankind is to make their interest coincide with their duty. That's a one-sentence summary of ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The interest of the man must be made consistent with the constitutional rights of the place that Madison makes in Federalist 51, explaining the separation of powers and checks and balances. And here it comes, the kicker. Even the love of fame, the ruling passion of the noblest minds, which would prompt a man to plan and undertake extensive and arduous enterprises for the public benefit, requiring considerable time to mature and perfect them, if he could flatter himself with the prospect of being allowed to finish what he had begun, would, on the contrary, deter from undertaking. So, what's the ruling passion of the noblest minds, of the greatest human beings? Love of fame. And as I suggested in class, and we'll make the point here, we think of fame as celebrity. Celebrity is what Justin Bieber has. Celebrity is what, I don't know, Lady Gaga has, what Bing Crosby had. And some of you do know who Bing Crosby was, and some of you don't. Because celebrity, which is instant, present fame, lasts a second. But fame is transcendent. It's like immortal, it's secular immortality. And the names that come to mind that you can think of historically, Alexander, Caesar, even vicious human beings like Hitler and Stalin, Mao, and Napoleon. But Washington and Lincoln, only the greatest and noblest souls moved by the desire to have secular immortality, which require great deeds. Because in 10 years, Justin Bieber will be some wisp of memory on YouTube, if even that. And that's true of most of the celebrities that are famous. But fame means you found a way of being remembered by subsequent generations, perhaps for all time. To do that, you need greatness. And therefore, Hamilton says this office is designed to appeal to that great passion, the desire for fame, the love of fame, the ruling passion of the noblest minds. Therefore, Hamilton wanted an office, an executive branch, in which, moved by this hierarchy of passions, great individuals would be moved to seek the presidency and hold on to it by doing great things. Therefore, using the institutional ingredients of unity, duration, competent powers, and adequate support to achieve the tasks of the executive branch, using energy, defense, law enforcement, order, and finally leadership. That is, I think, Hamilton's view of the presidency, and to some degree it represents the consensus of the framers in the Constitution, even though there was room for interpretation as to where the center of gravity in our constitutional system would lie, as I said, between Madison and Hamilton. But over time, it is Hamilton and Hamilton's understanding of the presidency that has guided how the office has grown and how it has accommodated itself to the changes in American life.